This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about openings. Where and how should you begin your story? And this will be one that connects to other episodes in the library. So make sure you head over to the show notes at storyworkspodcast.com, and Kathryn will get all of those related episodes linked up in a slider for you. So, openings. What's hard about them? What do we notice in writing that makes us pause?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that you want to feel attached to a character pretty quickly and understand what the story is probably likely to be about, or at least be intrigued enough to keep reading. And so if the opening doesn't feature the main character, then that puts an extra burden on the author. If the opening is setting descriptions or an info dump, then that puts a burden on the reader to try and plow through it before they get attached to a character. But I think as authors, as writers, we're attached to our story. So, we tend to think, right, that's we're going to start on the space station. There's going to be a battle. Oh no, I better have the politics sorted out before that, because otherwise they won't understand what's going on. But in order to understand the politics, we've probably got to go back a couple of millennia to see whether the human race just had that big problem where they had to, leave the solar system rapidly. Yeah, but then we really need to talk about the climate issues that force. So, I think we're so enthralled by our own proposition, which is great, that it can lead to wanting to put more in so that the reader, quote unquote, understands the story. Mm-hmm. When in actual fact, there's no need to understand the story. We just need to be moved by the story and want to continue reading. So I think it's quite tricky because where as an author, sometimes you don't know where that point is, and if we're told, "Oh, start in media res," but mm-hmm. sometimes that can feel too late. There's not enough. I've had that come back from a beta reader before, so I didn't really understand what was going on. Okay, right, so maybe I better drop in a little bit more backstory in there just in time.
Right, yeah, you've used a lot of really useful words there. Things that jumped out at me are character and understanding and backstory, and also, trying to do the politics and the world building, so creating info dumps. And I think you're spot on. What we want is to be engaged by a character. And that's that character, that protagonist, is our vehicle through the story. So if we don't have a character as an entry into the story, what use is the rest of it? Why do we care about the rest of it? Something might be dramatic and exciting, but that's only going to get us so far. So your opening hook might be the big explosive event, but then very quickly we need to be connected to that protagonist. And so much, I just had a student say she keeps finding new things she wants to put into Act 1 to set up Act 2. And I'm like, hang on, right? Act 1 should be tight and the story needs to unfold. So while it is the place for introductions and setup, we don't want that setup to bog us down. We want to let so much of what we learn about the character and the world unfold as we enter it. Just like being a tourist, you might go into a country with a guidebook, and so you've got little snippets of information about where you're going, little interesting pieces that pique your curiosity and get you to go there. But then once you're there, the fun is exploring on the ground and learning about the people and the place and the history and the culture while you're there living it.
Definitely, yeah. I think that's a really, really good analogy, because if you arrived at the country or the site, the spectacle, whatever it is that the tourist has gone to, and then the guide stood you outside and said, "Okay, let me just for a couple of hours explain the history of this." By the end of it, you'd be ready to tear their eyes out and say, "Can we just get on with it?" And so I think it's a little like that. It's such a tough balance because, as I alluded to earlier, if the guide said, right, okay, we're here, right, let's go through it. There's the stained glass windows, right, let's on to the next one now. You can't have it too fast either. You've got to have just enough for it to imbibe and provide a taste that wants to lure you in further. And I do think that it's quite hard as an author. I do think that sometimes you don't get it in your first draft either. You'll come back and you think, oh, I've got a lot of throat clearing here. I probably should either drip feed that throughout that opening part of the first act, or cut it. Or if there's some really, really good stuff in there that's taken up a couple of chapters, maybe it becomes a prequel novella that you give away. It's not to say there's not a good story in there. It's just a question of how is it relating to your current main character's arc.
Right.
And that's probably the key question, isn't it, really?
Yes. Yeah. And, the purpose of Act One is really for us to understand who this character is and what her life is like before her world gets turned upside down, before the inciting incident, when we cross that threshold from introductions and setup to rising action to the body of the main story. And so to get who this character is and what her world is like, we don't need everything spelled out for us. There's so much that we can glean in a shorthand form just by seeing this character in an exchange with another significant character, or seeing this character with a slice of daily life. And we get it. We've talked about the Hunger Games on the podcast before, and how if you meet Katniss Everdeen hunting for food with a bow and arrow for her family, which consists of a mother and a sister, okay, we know so much about who she is, her home life, the kind of responsibilities she takes on, the environment in which she lives. She's not pounding the pavement in a big city. We don't need to know what the games are yet, or what they mean to the community, what the socio-political, religious world consists of, to get us into that story.
Yeah, I think I do struggle with stories that have prologues, and I think it takes a great deal of mastery of writing to do that really well, and still keep your reader engaged enough that they're willing to go past the prologue and full on into the story. So I think it's why I'm wary of them, and one should never say never. Never have a prologue, because clearly it can be done. And also, that I put the question to you as well, both of you, that certain stories, well-known ones, have framing devices where, at the start it's an older version of the main character that's relating the story. We've got things like Princess Bride, where there is a very obvious framing device, and we get popped out every now and then to the grandfather and the kid. And they've been made to work, but these are authors who have tremendous, ability over their control over their skill. And I think it takes an awful lot of work to do that.
Well, I really like a well-done prologue. I use them when I feel like the story calls for it. I don't use them arbitrarily because I like them. But thinking of like Star Wars film, obviously not a novel, and the original Star Wars, which now is Star Wars 4. When you see Darth Vader board Princess Leia's ship, that's a prologue. Act One opens when we meet Luke Skywalker. And, why do that? Because it's a big, exciting, dramatic, explosive hook that sets up the larger stakes in the series for the entire series before we meet Luke in his microcosm of the farm. And right now, one of my classes is reading This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger, which opens with a prologue in which we meet the first person narrator as an old man, as you were talking about, Robert, how sometimes we have that framing device. And he tells us a little bit about the story he's going to tell. And the voice is very upbeat. But then we get into the story when he was a child, and the story is awfully depressing. It's the Great Depression, and we've got these kids at an orphanage, and there's abuse and hunger and all of this horrible stuff. And in the class, we've talked about, well, because of the prologue, we know this child will be okay at the end. And if we didn't have that in the back of our minds, we might want to leave the story and say, this is too depressing. I don't want to hear about how hard it is for this child, right? But you open with the prologue, and it gives the reader the sense of there will be a reward at the end of this that would be missing otherwise. If you're listening to this podcast, you are probably a writer, and you've maybe heard me talk about the StoryWorks reading series. It is the new branch in the StoryWorks family tree. It is a literary journal podcast. That's right, a hybrid, a literary journal for your ears, with a print anthology at the end of the year of the best of the podcast. I am open for submissions, and I want to see your best prose right now. I am taking both fiction and creative nonfiction. You can read the guidelines and submit your work at storyworkspodcast.com/submit. What are you waiting for? It's time to see your stories published and sit on the other side of this microphone from me. Have a conversation about your storycraft.
So that provokes for me a question of, I'm not skilled enough to know when a story demands it, when it requires it. And you mentioned that. You said, I don't mind using a prologue. I don't mind reading them when they're good, and I don't mind using it when the story requires it or appears to require it. Can you talk to those two things? So what makes a good prologue? I mean, you sort of alluded it to the tonality that it gave you with that the title you just mentioned, and then how do you know when it's a good idea to use one?
Right. So a prologue is necessary when you need to show the reader something that is outside the frame of the main story. So chapter 1 to the last chapter is your main frame. And within that main frame, you are not going to be jumping around chronologically or introducing multiple points of view in which the prologue could fit. So it is distinct from what you're doing within the main narrative. So it's a prologue, not a chapter, because it's distinct structurally and narratively and point of view, character point of view wise as well. But B, it's also essential for the reader to have this. So why do I need to give this to the reader? It's not because I want to give the reader a bunch of backstory. It's not because I developed the family lineage back 3 generations, and I think it's really cool if the reader knows this thing about great grandma before I introduce my protagonist. Those are selfish reasons. Those are reasons writers have that might feel essential, but it's because we have an emotional tie to that development, not because the story demands the reader understand this. In Saving Annabelle, I have a prologue and an epilogue framing it, and it's a different point of view than my first person narrative. And it is using that separate point of view is the only way to make sense of a small but crucial story element and to reveal to the readers ultimately the fate of my title character, Annabelle, who's not the narrator. Greta, the sister, is, right? Greta's the protagonist. And so in that sense, it's essential that the reader have this frame. On the other hand, personally, as the writer, I really like it and I think it's cool and I wanted to do it. So that's valid in its own right, but it needs to also be essential to end up in the final book.
Yeah. What about times when I know we don't obviously only want to talk about prologues and epilogues because that's just one form of opening and framing. What about, say, thrillers where sometimes you'll get a scene pulled from the middle of the story, maybe expressed in a slightly different way, but we know we're going to encounter that scene later because it might be the hero about to be at the mercy of the villain or something like that. Personally, I think that's a lazy way to stir up drama and tension. But it is done, well, it used to be done a lot. I don't know if it still is, honestly. Would that be something, that you would advise against or I suppose that, okay, so if I come back to what you just said, because I asked you the question about why do you use them, you use them because you want to reveal something you can't do any other way. And it's going to be crucial to a certain twist in the story, perhaps. So I suppose if I could write the thriller without putting the prologue in that set up the nasty moment that we all know that we're going to get to, then I would. But if I couldn't, then I might consider a prologue.
Right. Or you might make that chapter 1 if it's not outside the main frame of the story. It might be chapter 1. Here's this thing that happens. And then chapter 2 is 6 months earlier or 3 days earlier or whatever. And then you bring us back up to chapter 1. So, for me, the question of making it a prologue is it outside the frame of the main narrative? In some way. And if it's not, you could just make it chapter 1 and then go back in time and signal that to the reader clearly, So, and it can be poorly done and lazy, and it can also be well done. So for me as a writer, it comes down to doing an analysis of deconstructing it. Why would I have a scene in the middle first? How is that essential to the story I want to tell? Because if you're just doing it to try to pump some excitement into the reader, well, why don't you write an opening that is exciting to the reader? Why do you think you need to pull something from deep in your rising stakes and tension to the front to try to get the reader interested? Then I would say you're being lazy. Do a better job with your opening.
So it kind of just brings us all the way back to openings then, which is, there's a reason why people rewrite their first chapters over and over. It's because it's damn tricky. You've got to get your character in, you've got to get your setting in, you've got to set up their ordinary world, you've got to hint at the conflict that's coming, you've got to hint at their fatal flaw, you've got to hint at their emotional wounds from the past, you've got to sort of show their blind spots. I mean, it's and not only that, you've got to write this ripping first paragraph that's just going to be right up there with Dickens, No wonder so many of us, start out with it was a dark and stormy night. So I think they're really tricky, and I still like the opening in media res. I do think that's still reasonably good advice for the modern reader. I think we're so now taken by the Netflix culture that if the story doesn't start terribly fast, then people have got little patience because there's always something else waiting for them on their Kindle.
I think a lot of times that can be genre specific because there are plenty of stories that don't open with a bang, but they open with dramatic tension. They open with
that's what I mean.
Conflict. Yes.
I don't mean it necessarily has to be action in the sense of crime or thriller or action adventure. You just need to see we just need to experience the protagonist doing things.
Right.
as opposed to a page of explanation.
Right. You know, one of the things I do in my Write Great Openings course, one of the examples I used is The Wizard of Oz, because everybody who hasn't seen it, you know, and when you watch the opening of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy comes running home with Toto, and she's all afluster because the mean neighbor lady, Miss Gulch, has threatened to have the sheriff take Toto away. So we've got a very sympathetic, appealing young protagonist and a small animal, right? Like, get the heartstrings right there. Yes. And she's upset about something. She is in the middle of a very serious conflict. And she's turning to her aunt and uncle for help. And they're like, oh, Dorothy, we're busy. We've got to fix the fence. We've got to feed the chickens. Dorothy, don't bother us. I'm doing a poor aunt. What's her name? Aunt B, Aunt something. Auntie M. It was a letter. So that escalates the conflict because we know emotionally how important this crisis is to Dorothy. And we also know that adults don't always take children's conflict seriously. So it calms down. She's walking on the fence, talking to the farmhand. Everything's fine. And what happens? She falls in, right? It's no big deal, but there's a little fluster of activity around it. And oh my goodness, and she could have been hurt, and she gave her family a scare. And Miss Gulch comes riding along, threatening to take Toto away. And she does take Toto away. And we just see this escalation going up and up and up. And we are feeling it. We're feeling for Dorothy. We're feeling her loss. We're feeling her panic and her urgent need to do something, and that nobody who loves her is helping her in this situation. They let Miss Gulch take Toto away. I mean, this is huge. It's huge dramatic action. It's huge stakes. Yeah. And it's also very mundane, very small setting. We're just home on the farm, right? You could say nothing much is happening. The neighbor doesn't like her dog. But really, look at how powerful this is.
That's very true. I mean, it could have opened with just a minor info dump, you know. Dorothy didn't like the neighbor because the neighbor didn't like her dog.
Well, worse, it could have opened with the tornado.
Well, there you go. Yeah. The starting media res.
Less experienced writer thinks, I got to have big, exciting action. I'm going to start with the tornado, and the tornado's whipping my protagonist up into the air. But we don't know Dorothy if you start there. We don't know about her love for Auntie M. We don't know how important Toto is to her, the lengths to which she will go to rescue Toto. We don't know what drives her as a character, and we aren't feeling her yet, right? So you can't open in the tornado. That's your inciting incident. It's not your opening hook.
Yeah.
Your opening hook is Miss Gulch wants Toto.
Yep. Yeah, it again circles back to what we were talking about right at the start, which is you've got to get your character in there, and we need to attach to them somehow. You know, ultimately, the gifted, skilled writer is going to make that a foreshadow of what has to happen over the story, but an exciting enough hook that the reader wants to read in, but isn't so disconnected from what will be the inciting incident. So even though the dog incident and a tornado are completely different things, there's no way that they're causal. They both impact on Dorothy in similar ways. She's, you know, had familiar things being threatened to ripped away, and then familiar things are ripped away, you know, so it's clever.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Kathryn, now that you're settled in at the mic, want to say anything?
Well, I was just going to say almost the same thing, Robert. It's like you still have to match your story, right? So even though Dorothy dealing with the neighbor and her dog feels very different than Dorothy showing up in this brand new world, right? We still have similar thematic concepts. We still have a similar plot, the character. I mean, like the things match up. It's not so much that you're just like, what happened to my Great Depression farm story? That's what I thought I was going to get. Like, you understand going in the story you're going to get, and you follow it all the way through. And I think that's where great openings, they catch you because you already know the story that's going to be told, right? And the opening just reinforces that. It reinforces the story that you're on the journey for.
Yes, yes. And the story in The Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum's novel, I'm thinking of the movie, right? But let's not forget the novel. The story is not about the tornado. The tornado is just a vehicle to get her from Kansas to Oz. The story is about Dorothy protecting her loved ones because she is the ultimate loyal friend against all odds and in the face of any danger, hence Miss Gulch and the Wicked Witch. I mean, that's why in the movie version, you see Miss Gulch in the tornado on the bicycle, and then it turns into the Wicked Witch on the broomstick. They aren't hiding from you the parallels, and that this is the same conflict, whether we're in Kansas or Oz, and Dorothy is the same hero throughout the story.
Yeah, that's I remember when I was learning a little bit about hypnotherapy. One of the things that we talked about were constructing stories that were metaphors that had an identical embedded structure to the structure of the explanation that you want to give to the person logically about how to extract themselves from their issue or their baggage or whatever it was they needed to overcome. And Milton Erickson, the grandfather of hypnotherapy, just had some amazing stories that he would come out with, just apparently off the cuff, and he would, it was as if he was just chatting to his client, not even having them in for therapy, and all of a sudden they'd be changed. And I think you can look at the opening of your story in a similar way, in that when you come back to edit, how many of those structural elements of the mini arc at the opening reflect the grander scheme of the protagonist's arc and what they need to learn, what's their object of desire, how do things get in the way of that. And just simple things like the way you explained the opening of The Wizard of Oz there, just her falling in off the fence, shows that she's, impulsive. She jumps up on things and then falls in. And we know at some point later in the story, she's going to do something impulsive that's going to get her into trouble, So I think the consistency of that, that one's more obvious. It's not really a deeply embedded metaphor, but in the sense that everything that you craft in that opening is going to have, if you wanted to, some impact on how the reader perceives what happens later in the story. So, no wonder they feel daunting to write. And my advice is just regurgitate your story first and get it down there. And then, as we all know, sometimes you end up either picking the third chapter as a start, or having to wind back a bit, or having to dial a lot of things in that need to be foreshadowed, but without putting in these great big info dumps as an aside, saying, I need to explain this bit, why this castle's here and why the moat doesn't work anymore,
Right. Yeah, I think revising with an eye to essentialism is important for these openings, really combing through Act One and saying, what is essential? If the reader doesn't need to know this right now to understand right now, it can be revealed later. It can be explored, unfolded, given with imagery, put into a scenario in a scene with the protagonist. However, that can happen organically. But in the present, in the opening of the story, focus on that character, get us the empathetic connection, and show us the world right before everything changes.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.